Within the philosophical masterpiece, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Friedrich Nietzsche presents three foundational doctrines through the voice of his titular prophet: the will to power, the eternal recurrence, and the Ubermensch. Having thoroughly examined the first two concepts in our earlier explorations, we now turn our attention to comprehensively unpacking the latter. To begin, we must address the linguistic nuances of the term Übermensch itself. Early English interpreters offered beyond man, while subsequent versions opted for Superman, a choice that unfortunately led to enduring confusion with the famous comic book hero. Other variations have included superhuman and Uberman, but the esteemed Nietzschean academic Walter Kaufmann compellingly argues that Overman serves as the most accurate English equivalent. Consequently, we shall rely primarily on this translation, while occasionally honoring the original German terminology.
It is crucial to recognize that Nietzsche harbored a deep reverence for the American essayist Ralph Waldo Emerson. In his personal journals, the philosopher famously expressed an unparalleled sense of belonging within Emerson's writings, claiming they felt too intimately connected to his own spirit to even warrant traditional praise. Emerson famously introduced the concept of the oversoul in a titular essay, an idea that likely shaped Nietzsche's eventual selection of the word Übermensch, thereby reinforcing Overman as an exceptionally fitting translation. Furthermore, when Nietzsche rendered oversoul into German, he chose the phrasing the higher soul, a linguistic bridge that almost certainly inspired his later use of the expression the higher man. Interestingly, the specific notion of the Overman did not fully crystallize until the philosopher reached his later years. Prior to this, however, he frequently discussed the idea of free spirits, a conceptual precursor that would ultimately mature into the character of Zarathustra, the very prophet tasked with heralding the arrival of the Overman. In an earlier work, entitled Human All Too Human, a book for free spirits, he famously offered a dedication to these liberated minds, acknowledging that, while they were not yet a reality, their gradual emergence was inevitable. During periods plagued by debilitating sickness, profound solitude, and professional stagnation, he found immense comfort in mentally communing with these visionary figures, using their imagined presence to sustain his joy and laughter. Ultimately, such a liberated mind actively dismantles societal norms, catalyzing cultural evolution and pushing humanity forward. Within the narrative of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, attaining the status of the Overman is directly tied to completing a tripartite journey of psychological transformation, concluding with the stage of the child. This process of radical self-overcoming requires navigating three distinct symbolic phases: the burden-bearing camel, the rebellious lion, and finally, the innocent child. Naturally, adopting the initial role of the camel is a formidable task that demands you to first embrace the ethos of the free spirit, willingly abandoning familiarity to shoulder immense psychological burdens and practice deep self-sacrifice. This entails deliberately undermining your own ego, intentionally showcasing your foolishness to puncture any illusions of grand wisdom you might hold. Essentially, the philosopher argues that the moment you begin to harbor feelings of self-importance, you must immediately seek out greater burdens to shatter that arrogance and cultivate profound humility. Following this, the individual must evolve into the lion, a fierce embodiment of liberation that fiercely declares a sacred no to the dogmatic traditions and restrictive societal codes that previously served as chains. Once the past has been completely repudiated by this ferocious negation, the soul transitions into the final phase of the child, a state defined by boundless imagination and uninhibited play. Here, the individual joyously proclaims a sacred yes, passionately embracing existence and initiating a completely fresh chapter, devoid of any oppressive spirit of heaviness. Upon reaching this ultimate stage of psychological alchemy, you finally gain the capacity to actualize your truest self. By adopting a childlike consciousness, fully anchored in the present, brimming with curiosity, and overflowing with inventive energy, you unlock the power to forge your own unique moral compass, thereby ascending to the level of the Overman. This elevated being represents the absolute apex of human potential, conquering the despair of nihilism by generating personal meaning and anchoring all attention firmly in the terrestrial world, rather than holding out hope for an afterlife. Operating as an entirely independent creator, this figure places absolute trust in their own capabilities, refusing to lean on external crutches or spiritual safety nets. Ascending to this supreme level of self-mastery means transcending the average human condition, fearlessly meeting every hardship head-on, and eagerly accepting whatever chaotic events destiny might hurl at you. By deliberately leaving mediocrity behind and embracing a life of necessary risk, such a person embodies the iconic declaration, "The Overman shall be the meaning of the earth." Ultimately, conquering your own internal landscape stands as the most agonizing challenge imaginable, demanding a monumental amplification of internal strength rather than domination over your peers. This internal conquest is deeply intertwined with the principle of the will to power, where true joy is discovered in the sensation of expanding one's capabilities and successfully breaking through personal barriers. Consequently, the Overman emerges as the most deeply fulfilled individual imaginable, serving as the ultimate validation for human existence. Contrary to widespread assumption, the explicit introduction of this revolutionary concept did not actually happen within the pages of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Instead, the philosopher initially deployed the term in a specific passage from the Gay Science, noting that humanity's historical creation of deities, mythical heroes, and various forms of overmen served as an invaluable training ground for eventually validating personal sovereignty and individual egoism. He theorized that the same absolute liberty ancient peoples projected onto their pantheon of gods would eventually be claimed by individuals seeking independence from restrictive laws, cultural habits, and the judgment of their peers. Within this specific context, the Overmen appear to mirror the divine figures and legendary champions of Hellenic antiquity, acting as potent symbols against mass conformity and serving as the ultimate antidotes to cultural stagnation. Therefore, discovering your authentic identity requires you not merely to excavate the traits buried deep within, but rather to strive relentlessly toward a version of yourself that hovers majestically above your current state. That particular aphorism holds tremendous historical weight, as it provides a rare glimpse into the development of this concept immediately prior to the creation of his defining masterpiece. It is ultimately within Thus Spoke Zarathustra that the Overman is officially unveiled to the world, taking center stage alongside the equally groundbreaking philosophies of the eternal recurrence and the will to power, all of which were finally brought to full maturity by the prophet's sermons. The narrative dramatically unfolds as the enlightened hermit leaves his mountainous retreat and enters a bustling settlement, encountering a large gathering of citizens in the central plaza who are eagerly anticipating a performance by an acrobat. Seizing this momentous occasion, the sage addresses the assembled masses with a world-shattering proclamation. "I teach you the Overman. Man is something that should be overcome." How exactly have you worked to transcend your current state? Every species before us has generated something greater than itself, yet you might be choosing to represent the receding waters of this immense evolutionary wave, reverting to primal beasts rather than surpassing humanity. Consider what a primate represents to a human being, a source of mockery or a source of deep shame. Consequently, humanity will represent precisely that same mockery and shame to the Overman. You have crawled up from the dirt, evolving from a lowly worm into a human, but a significant portion of your nature remains tethered to the dirt. Long ago, your ancestors were primates, and even today, a person often exhibits more primitive behavior than any actual primate. Listen closely, for I am presenting you with the concept of the Overman, who embodies the ultimate purpose of this world. Your deepest desires should proudly declare that the Overman must become the very essence of our existence. Where can you find the electrifying strike meant to ignite your spirit, or the necessary frenzy required to purify your soul? I offer you the Overman, for he represents both that piercing strike and that purifying frenzy. The gathered crowd, failing entirely to grasp his profound message, erupts into mocking laughter, mistakenly believing he is introducing the tightrope walker they came to watch. Meanwhile, the actual acrobat, assuming the philosopher's grand introduction was meant for his performance, promptly begins his dangerous routine. Observing the confused audience with a sense of wonder, Zarathustra explains that human existence is merely a fragile cord stretched across a terrifying void, connecting the animal to the Overman. Navigating this path involves a perilous traversal, a hazardous journey forward, a risky glance backward, and a terrifying moment of hesitation. The true greatness of humanity lies in our function as a transitional bridge rather than a final destination, making our willingness to transition and ultimately perish a truly admirable quality. In the original German text of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, a complex layer of linguistic nuance exists that often vanishes during translation, particularly regarding his descent from the peaks. This journey as a solitary traveler represents his Untergang, or going under, as he seeks to distribute the profound insights he accumulated during 10 years of absolute isolation. This downward journey stands in sharp contrast to his forward progression, known as Übergang, and his personal mastery, termed Überwindung, both of which powerfully point toward the ultimate realization of the Ubermensch. Essentially, achieving true self-mastery, or Selbstüberwindung, inherently requires a willingness to submerge oneself entirely into the depths of human experience. You cannot separate the emergence of the Overman from the fundamental act of continuous self-conquest, a theme echoed repeatedly through the assertion that humanity is merely a phase meant to be transcended. Yet, the onlookers remain oblivious, continuing to mock him, completely embodying the antithesis of the Overman, which the philosopher labels the last man. These individuals desperately crave conformity, revel in absolute mediocrity, and flee from any genuine risk, finding their shallow happiness in remaining indistinguishable from everyone else. As Zarathustra details the pathetic nature of this last man, the audience enthusiastically interrupts, begging him to transform them into exactly that uninspired creature, while rejecting the superior ideal. He watches their cheering and laughter with profound sadness, quietly realizing that his profound words are falling upon entirely unreceptive ears. Simultaneously, the spectators turn their unwavering attention back to the acrobat, who has cautiously navigated to the exact center of his perilous high-wire act, perfectly illustrating humanity's precarious evolution from beast to Overman. Without warning, a flamboyant jester emerges behind the performer, taunting him relentlessly before letting out a demonic shriek and leaping directly over the terrified man. Stunned by his rival's sudden dominance, the acrobat loses his balance, abandons his balancing pole, and plunges toward the earth. Rushing to the side of the critically injured performer, Zarathustra listens as the broken man gasps that a demonic force has caused his fall and is now dragging him to eternal damnation. The philosopher gently reassures his dying friend, swearing on his honor that neither demons nor eternal torment actually exist, meaning his consciousness will vanish even before his physical body expires. Looking up with a flicker of doubt, the fallen acrobat whispers that if this absolute finality is true, his existence amounted to nothing more than that of a mindless beast.
Zarathustra immediately corrects him, praising the man for dedicating his life to confronting profound danger and promising to personally lay him to rest as a mark of deep respect. Following these comforting words, the shattered performer takes his final breath, making a faint gesture with his hand in a silent attempt to express his profound gratitude. Through this tragic vignette, the author suggests that the acrobat, by actively risking his own destruction, led a truly commendable existence that starkly contrasts with the safe, hollow lives of the modern masses. A defining trait of the Overman is precisely this unflinching willingness to face peril head-on, embracing those who willingly step toward their own destruction because they are the ones genuinely advancing humanity. This constant exposure to profound risk serves as the essential architecture bridging the gap toward our highest potential. The text emphatically declares that the ultimate key to extracting the maximum reward and unparalleled joy from our brief time here is to consciously choose a path defined by extreme peril. By depicting humanity as an acrobat balancing on a wire, the narrative highlights our dual nature as both the architect and the creation, encompassing everything painfully ordinary alongside our boundless potential. This superior, enlightened version of ourselves represents the individual who has achieved total emotional and intellectual sovereignty, fulfilling the true destiny of the Overman. When the text proclaims that this elevated being must become the sole focus of our world, it demands that you anchor your ambitions firmly in the present reality, rather than squandering your potential on the hollow promise of an afterlife. I urge you to remain deeply loyal to this physical realm, rejecting the toxic individuals who preach about otherworldly rewards, for they are resentful enemies of vitality. Historically, defying a divine creator was considered the ultimate transgression, but that supreme authority has perished, rendering those archaic concepts of sin completely obsolete alongside it. Friedrich Nietzsche asserted that committing an offense against our mortal world is the ultimate transgression, warning against valuing the mysteries of the unknowable above the profound significance of earthly existence. He argued that fixating on an afterlife merely exposes a deep-seated resentment toward reality, prompting anguished individuals to fabricate an alternate realm where their desire for cosmic vengeance might be satisfied. This escapist fantasy necessitated the creation of an eternal soul detached from our physical form, ultimately breeding a culture of asceticism and physical self-denial. However, the philosopher vehemently maintained that the physical flesh and the conscious spirit are inextricably bound together. Observing the cultural fading of Christian dominance, Nietzsche anticipated a terrifying descent into societal nihilism, a catastrophe he famously illustrated through the parable of the madman announcing the death of God. This tragic declaration highlighted how centuries of religious dogma had systematically degraded the value of mortal life in favor of a promised heaven, while simultaneously elevating an unquestionable, absolute truth. Ultimately, he proposed that the church had engineered its own demise by cultivating a will to nothingness, a paradoxically active drive that, while inherently hostile to vital existence, remained a powerful psychological force. Humanity inherently prefers to desire oblivion rather than to lack desire altogether. Yet this impulse injected a toxic perspective into human consciousness that severely diminished the worth of our present reality. Consequently, the metaphorical death of the divine tore open the abyssal void of nihilism, plunging our species into a historical crisis that demands an extraordinary evolutionary leap. This required transformation is strictly ideological rather than biological, demanding that you fundamentally interrogate the entire canon of Western philosophy and cultivate a radically revitalized engagement with your own existence. This existential emergency originates from a chronic yearning for a spiritual beyond, a pervasive urge, prevalent since the era of Socrates, to escape the supposed confinement of our flesh and our terrestrial environment. Standing in fierce opposition to this escapism, the character of Zarathustra
passionately urges you to remain entirely faithful to the earth and its tangible realities. Progressing to the next stage of human development necessitates dismantling the ancient dualisms separating mind from body and spirit from nature, a monumental undertaking Nietzsche defined as the revaluation of all values, driven by the concepts of the Overman, the eternal recurrence, and the will to power. In the wake of a shattered divine framework, the philosopher strove to provide a robust alternative to archaic moralities, encouraging you to redirect your gaze from supernatural illusions back toward the immediate world. He envisioned the Overman as the ultimate antidote to the despair of meaninglessness, a triumphant figure who embodies the true purpose we must forge for our own destinies. Radiating an overwhelming abundance of vitality and health, this superior being naturally overflows with creative generosity, fulfilling the bold proclamation at the conclusion of Zarathustra's prologue. Since all deities have perished, our ultimate desire must be the ascendance of the Overman at the great noontide. The narrative also introduces the concept of higher men, distinguished individuals who actively champion these revolutionary philosophical concepts by relying entirely on their own strength to ascend, rather than passively waiting for salvation. A person must elevate themselves to such a towering intellectual altitude that they invite the shattering strike of lightning, boldly embracing the inherent dangers of true greatness. Characterized as free spirits, future-oriented thinkers, and inventive savants, these pioneers blend rigorous intellectual integrity with profound aesthetic sensibility, perfectly mirroring the poetic and artistic lifestyle that the author himself practiced and prescribed. Within the fourth section of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the wise protagonist reflects on his initial foolish attempt to share his revelations with the chaotic masses in the public marketplace, realizing that broadcasting his message to the general crowd meant communicating with absolutely no one. The author's work was deliberately crafted to be exclusive, perfectly encapsulated by the subtitle, A Book for All and None, targeting only those rare individuals willing to gamble everything for authentic satisfaction. He warns these exceptional few that the average populace will always fiercely reject the existence of superiority, desperately clinging to the outdated, religiously instilled delusion of universal equality even long after their deity has perished. Despite their elevated status, these exceptional individuals remain starkly distinct from the Overman, ultimately recognizing their own fundamental limitations when confronted with Zarathustra's demanding teachings. The sage openly critiques their insufficient strength, lamenting that throughout history, he has only ever encountered people who remain disappointingly similar in their shared, flawed humanity, whether they are deemed great or insignificant. Even the most remarkable figures retain inescapable human frailties, reinforcing the core philosophical premise that the true Overman represents an unprecedented ideal of continuous, radical self-overcoming. This concept of perpetual self-mastery is inextricably linked to the doctrines of the will to power and the eternal recurrence, a terrifying thought experiment demanding that you willingly relive your exact existence, with every triumph and agony on an infinite loop. For the author, this repeating cosmic cycle was not merely an abstract theory, but a profound, lived reality, forged in the crucible of his own immense physical and emotional suffering. Embracing his self-proclaimed role in Twilight of the Idols as the ultimate student of Dionysus, he passionately taught that true joy inherently demands a profound, inescapable eternity for all things. This daunting hypothesis functions as the ultimate psychological litmus test, completely crushing fragile minds who can only endure their current reality by obsessing over the promised glories of a celestial paradise. Conversely, for the fiercely resilient, this agonizingly heavy philosophical burden transforms into the most powerful catalyst imaginable, relentlessly driving them toward the absolute pinnacle of their own evolutionary perfection. The concept of eternal recurrence serves as the profoundest validation of existence, envisioning an unending cycle where our current reality repeats without alteration. As Nietzsche suggests, embracing this idea demands an intensely passionate devotion to living, a state where you desire nothing more desperately than this final, everlasting guarantee and cosmic signature upon your experiences. This process of personal transcendence finds its expression through the will to power, which fundamentally means achieving mastery over your own nature to realize your true self. You discover this strength primarily when confronting and navigating difficult barriers, recognizing that suffering and elation are intimately intertwined. In fact, profound agony often gives rise to a magnificent sense of euphoria that feels genuinely divine in its nature. Navigating this emotional dichotomy drives your evolution toward the Overman, an ideal being who joyfully welcomes the infinite loop of existence as the supreme champion of reality. This sentiment is perfectly captured in the philosopher's recipe for human magnificence, known as amor fati, a mindset where you refuse to wish for any changes in the past, the present, or the infinite future. Consequently, your identity remains in a state of perpetual development, always striving for the loftiest, most seemingly unattainable celestial objectives. Ultimately, this continuous act of self-overcoming acts as the essential thread weaving together the will to power, the vision of the Overman, and the daunting reality of eternal recurrence. Mastering your own spirit truly stands as one of the most crucial and foundational pillars within Nietzsche's entire intellectual legacy.